All right, you can go ahead, Steve.
Well, welcome everyone to another evening of exploration and discovery. Well, last evening we had a scientist who studied earthquakes and other things. This evening we have the opportunity to learn from two people who will share with us about when disaster strikes, how to be ready for it, both in the field and at home. So it's my pleasure to introduce two truly adventurous explorers. In fact, both the members of the Explorers Club, and they both epitomize what our club is all about. For example, Jason Harper is a journalist and Explorer Club member who has spent 25 years writing about culture, travel, adventure around the world. And Jason bills himself as a modern storyteller. You know, as a geologist, we like to tell stories too. But Jason likes to tell stories that stoke passions and inspire people to take the dream of journey or act on them and an inspiration. And what do I mean by an inspiration? Well, in the last 5 years, he's pivoted to about the climate crisis and mitigation at a small level, at the micro level, on how to best protect ourselves, our families, communities, and this escalating threat of storms and floods and wildfires, etc. And indeed, he's formed a disaster advice media company aimed at preparing individuals and companies for the climate crisis. And so I find, as a climate scientist, I find this super important. I'm so glad he's doing this. George Kourounis is an award-winning explorer and documentarian of natural disasters. And so that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, and Earth's extremes, including tornadoes, hurricane, floods, etc. He's been a regular contributor for several Science Channel TV shows. He actually hosted his own program, Angry Planet, which has been broadcast for over 100 countries now. You can see his work on so many different channels, Discovery Channel, National Geographic, so on and so forth. He's also been chasing storms like tornadoes for over about 20 years now. And he's the first person to ever film inside three of the world's most fearsome forces. Holy shoot. Inside a tornado, ouch. Inside the eye of a hurricane, and inside an active volcano. Okay, I would love to share a drink with him and talk about this. And so based on these two people, this evening's presentation is entitled When Disaster Strikes, Readiness in Field and at Home. So buckle up, everyone. George and Jason, you have the stage.
Well, thank you, Stephen. You did a great job last night talking about the earthquakes as well. So this is kind of a nice segue into it, right?
Absolutely.
George, we're going to be the fun disasters guys tonight, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So Jason and I have been having quite a few discussions about what we're going to talk about tonight. And because this is for the Explorers Club, we're going to do it in basically two parts. We're going to talk about disaster avoidance while you are out on expedition, but then we're going to also bring it home and give you some tips and tricks as to disaster-proof your home and your life. So this, hopefully you take a few nuggets away home, from tonight's talk, and make your life a little bit safer out in the field and at home.
Cool. Take it away, sir.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me get this rolling here. So. Hold on one second. I just need to do one. There we go. We're good. All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Stephen. My name is George Kourounis. I'm the Canadian chapter chair of the Explorers Club. I'm also explorer in residence with the Royal Canadian Geographical Society and a few other titles and stuff that I'm not going to bother getting into. But my specialty is documenting extreme forces of nature and natural disasters worldwide. And I mainly do it for television, but I also work with scientists around the world. And sometimes I go into some of these difficult and dangerous places to gather scientific samples that are not always easy for scientists themselves to get, because I have been doing this for over 20 years and I have a lot of skills and experience in doing this kind of thing. So anywhere from chasing tornadoes, which is something I've been doing for well over 20 years, documenting storms all around the world of every different kind, including hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, all over the Caribbean, documenting volcanic eruptions worldwide in Indonesia, Congo, Ethiopia, Cape Verde, Tonga, all over the place. A lot of caving as well, some of the world's most extreme environments underground, including the Nika Crystal Cave, which is unbearably hot and humid, but it's so beautiful. To even planting satellite tracking tags on top of icebergs off the coast of Newfoundland, which requires literally climbing up these floating icebergs that are the size of apartment buildings, to trekking the mountains of North Korea, to documenting extremophile bacteria inside a flaming pit in the middle of the Turkmenistan desert for National Geographic. So that's basically 20 years worth of resume compressed into about a minute and a half there. So I spent a lot of time around disasters, a lot of time around big expeditions in very remote places around the world. And so this was our campsite in Turkmenistan for the fire pit expedition. And what I want to basically talk to you guys about is staying safe while out on expedition. And of course, safe is in air quotes because you can only be so safe, right? It's all about mitigating disaster, or mitigating risk rather, not eliminating risk. Anytime you do anything really, there's always going to be some amount of risk, whether it's driving to work, whether it's climbing Mount Everest or going to the bottom of the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench. There's always going to be some risk involved. So it's all about deciding what risk you're comfortable with and finding the best ways to mitigate the risks so that you're able to do what you're trying to do. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the best way to avoid or to stay safe from danger really is to know about it and deal with it before it ever happens. So in an expedition context, before you ever leave home, before you arrive at your destination, you need to already have an idea of what the potential threats to your mission are going to be, right? And there's lots of logistics issues and things like that, but we're going to specifically talk about potential disasters. And I've broken them down into basically 3 categories. I'm going to mainly talk about the third one, but I do want to touch on these first 2 categories because they are rather important. Societal hazards, that's what I call them, the first category. And that's people, right? So anytime you go somewhere on a big expedition or travel of any kind, you're going to be potentially going to a place that you're not familiar with. Well, is there war at this particular place? Is there a threat of war? Are there any kind of demonstrations going on? Elections, riots. I was in Eastern Congo one time, right around the time of some very important elections, and tensions were high. So we had to have armed guards with us. So do you need to have that kind of protection with you? The State Department has a really good website, state.gov, that can help you take a look and see what some of these societal risks might be in terms of terrorism, etc. And then, of course, crime. That's always going to be an issue. It does vary depending upon where you are, of course. If you're out in the middle of nowhere of Mongolia doing some archaeological expedition, then, crime is probably not your biggest concern. But if you're in a favela in Brazil, then that is at the top of your list of concerns. And Jason's actually going to go into some specific detail about this. So I'm setting up the pitch for him. He's going to talk more about that later. Hazard number 2, health. So there's a lot more. We're all biological beings. We have to take care of ourselves. When you're on expedition, it's not always easy, especially now. The pandemic is looming over top of all of us right now. It's that disaster in the background. And both Jason and I are going to talk more about compounding disasters. And right now, pretty much anything is a compound disaster with COVID going on. So what are the travel restrictions? What are the current caseloads in different places where you might want to travel to? Can you afford to do a 2-week quarantine in a hotel somewhere just to do your expedition? Is that even safe or possible? There are local health concerns. Are you going to a malaria-prone area, dengue fever, cholera outbreaks? Do you have all your travel vaccinations in order? These are things that you may not necessarily have at the front of mind, but can have a tremendous effect on the outcome of your expeditions. Um, you might have to have some very uncomfortable conversations with your teammates about some previous medical conditions that you might have. I understand the privacy of medical records. I get that. But if you come onto a team and you have a condition that might jeopardize the health and safety of your teammates, then the onus is upon you to disclose these kind of things, or else you're putting everyone in jeopardy. So I put that on the list. And then there's proximity. How close are you to the closest medical care? Are there hospitals where you're going? Insurance. For example, when I was in North Korea, I had zero medical insurance whatsoever. And it just so happens, because all my insurance was void while I was in North Korea, of course, I had a medical problem. I had a hernia that started to act up. And while I was climbing up the mountain, I had to keep stuffing my hand down my pants to shove my intestines back into my abdomen. So there's something you got to think about. Also, training, first aid training and such. I mean, we could do an entire college course on disaster preparation. So tonight we're just hitting the highlights. But what I really want to touch upon and what's really in my wheelhouse is natural and environmental hazards, the disasters, right? Those type of things. So let's go into some details, shall we? So what kind of environmental disasters can we run into? Well, obviously, weather hazards, wind, rain, snow, ice, flooding, those are the most common ones. But over and above that, if you're planning an expedition to, let's say, the Philippines, what are their seasons like? When's their rainy season? Do you really want to be there during typhoon season? When is typhoon season, right? These are things that you have to research ahead of time. Are you going to be in, let's say, South Dakota doing some type of paleontological dig? Well, if you're doing it in June, then that's the peak of storm season, right? So there's things you got to take into consideration, especially in the winter time. And then, of course, there's Stephen's specialty, geologic forces. Are you going to an earthquake-prone area? Is there any volcanic activity? We all remember, of course, Europe getting shut down by the Eyjafjallajökull volcano in Iceland, and I think I almost pronounced that correctly. So if you're in the mountains, mudslides, avalanches, these are all big risks. And then, of course, we've all seen how devastating the fires have been the past couple of years, especially in California and Oregon this past year. So what I want to do is I want to keep this, I don't want to be all doom and gloom. So what I want to do is I want to showcase these different disasters and I want to give you a top 2 or 3 tips. I don't want to go into a ton of detail, but the top tips on how to keep yourself safe in those situations. A lot of it comes down to pre-preparation, of course. This is my basement. This is all my gear, the way I have it all organized. I don't consider myself a prepper in any way, but I am prepared. And I can be very quick to gather all of the supplies that I need for any given expedition. Because I document weather a lot of it happens very quickly. So I've got to be able to gather all my things real quick. So along with that, I'm just going to throw up a real quick list here of some of the emergency and safety gear that you might want to bring on your expeditions. You really should have most of this stuff, really. But let's just go through a quick list in case, to jog anyone's memory. Water and food, high priorities. Things to start a fire as well. Communications equipment. My favorite piece of comms gear is the DeLorme InReach. And it's a satellite-based unit, fits in the palm of your hand, it connects to your phone, I can tweet, I can post to Facebook, I can send and receive emails and text messages. It's amazing. I've used them all over the world. It's great. Have your first aid training and all of your medications and everything in order. Power is always an issue. Do you have the right adapters for the countries that you're going to, right? Those do become quite important. I sometimes bring solar panels and all kinds of things such as that, so that I have power when I'm out in remote areas. Tools, flashlights, documents, always carry copies of your passport, entry visas, any kind of dig permits or anything that you have like that, and keep them separate, right? Keep them in a separate bag. There's no point in having a scan of your passport in the same bag as your passport, because if that gets stolen, then what are you going to do? I also always carry emergency funds in several currencies. I'll always have the local currency and US cash. I'm a Canadian, so I usually have Canadian money on me as well, but US cash is still king, even in the world that we live in today that's becoming more and more cashless. So I always try to have some of that on board, as well as more than one type of credit card. On expeditions, I always carry a Visa and a MasterCard because sometimes the system is down. And if I can't use one card, then I have another one that's on a completely different system. And I learned that lesson the hard way when I was in Peru one time. So I never let that happen again. And also printouts of emergency contacts. It's 2021. Nobody remembers anyone's phone number, right? I don't memorize phone numbers anymore. Few people do. So having a printout of important contact information, friends, family, teammates, contacts at home, I hate to say next of kin, but your emergency contacts back home, the consulate, the passport office, the embassy, things like that. Print them out and laminate them if you can, or put them in a plastic sleeve. And then, of course, there's the specific gear for certain environments that you're going to. If you're going to be in the desert, goggles are a must. Avalanche beacon, if you're in the mountains. I always bring gas masks to volcanoes. If you're in a marine environment, of course, life vests, things like that. And know how to use your gear. It's really a shame to have the gear but not know how to use it. So let's get specific. Let's start with these big tornadoes. As a matter of fact, there was a tornado that hit just outside of Birmingham, Alabama just last night, and I know of at least one fatality. So these things are the most violent winds on Earth. They are usually part of a much larger storm, these rotating supercell storms, and they're the same storms that can produce tremendous flooding, lightning, large hail, and of course these tornadoes. So where do they occur? Well, the United States gets 75% of the world's tornadoes, about over 1,000 a year, but they also happen in the Australian outback, across Europe, Japan. Bangladesh gets some pretty deadly ones, especially in the month of April, but Argentina gets quite a few as well. So there's just a quick guide to show you where you need to be conscious of this particular threat. And so what do you do? Well, the safest place is to be indoors in a basement. If you don't have a basement, get into a closet, interior room, things like that. A car is basically a death trap because the tornado will crumple it and just toss it like a Coke can. And there's one weather pattern I really want you to think about next time you're out in the field if you start to experience these conditions. Beware of this pattern where you start getting light rain and then heavy rain, the thunder is now rolling. Then you start to get small hail, and then that hail gets larger. Suddenly you have large hail, maybe to golf ball size or larger, and then silence. Or winds shifting, going from one direction to the other. That's typically, but not always, when a tornado will occur. They're usually, again, but not always, in the part of a storm where the air is going into it, these updraft regions. So when the rain and hail stops, take a look around, because this is what might be coming for you, right? This might be the result. This is, they can be extremely damaging. We're talking the strongest tornadoes can have wind speeds of 250 miles an hour. And there's a really good example of why cars are not a great idea. When it comes to wildfires, a couple of things I want you to keep in mind. If you're anywhere in the forest, especially during the hot summer months, this picture I took from a helicopter in northern Ontario here, is that when it comes to fire, fire's the only thing that can travel uphill faster than it can travel downhill. So never be uphill of a fire and never be downwind of a fire, because those embers can travel for miles ahead of the storm and ignite fuel sources around you. So again, I'm going to burn through these literally, burn through them to just hit the top safety bits here. So I cannot stress enough how important it is to never be uphill of a fire, because this is what can happen. Homes completely destroyed in a matter of minutes, and you do not want to be caught in that. From hot to cold, of course, winter weather. We're all familiar with winter weather. We've got some pretty good winter weather today where I am in Toronto. Snow and ice storms can be extremely destructive, dealing with power outages especially, and driving hazards. The number one problem with winter driving or winter hazards is going to be driving. Slow down, be cautious, and please turn on your headlights. Even during the day, it's not so that you can see them, it's so that they can see you. I cannot, as a Canadian winter driver, please turn on your headlights. And of course, when it comes to cold weather, dressing in multiple layers. Never once have I ever regretted bringing too much clothes, too much clothing on a cold weather expedition. Switching to hurricanes, of course, these are the largest storms in the world. Depending upon where you are in the world, they can either be called hurricanes, typhoons, or tropical cyclones. They all mean the same thing. These, of course, gigantic storms with the calm eye. And this is where they happen, the worldwide distribution. Of course, the Atlantic, we're familiar. We had a very busy Atlantic hurricane season this year, but the Pacific gets them, especially in places like Taiwan, Philippines, Japan. You also get them in the Southern Hemisphere, of course, in Australia and in the Indian Ocean. And they do rotate the other way in the Southern Hemisphere. We even get them in Canada. This is from Peggy's Cove in Nova Scotia. And that 150-foot wave crashed right on top of me and my car. That's the car I use for chasing storms. It's got almost 500,000 kilometers on it. I try to beat it. I try to break it and I can't. It keeps coming back for more. So in terms of safety tips for hurricanes, the most dangerous part of a hurricane is not the wind, it's actually the storm surge, the flooding that comes with these hurricanes. The winds push a lump of seawater inland, and that seawater can destroy everything in its path. During Hurricane Katrina, the sea level went up by 28 feet above normal, and this is what it did to the coastline in Mississippi and Louisiana. That is a house that has been lifted by the water and dropped on top of a car. So, 2 safety tips for hurricanes. They're absolutely massive storms. So when you're watching let's say the Weather Channel or your local forecast, and you see that cone of uncertainty that the National Weather Service or the National Hurricane Center puts out, it shows you a broad swath, but there's always a line in the middle. Don't focus on that one line. That's where they think the center of the storm could be, but because the hurricanes are so wide, you're going to feel its effects throughout that entire zone, not just in the center. So if you're at the edge of one of these cones of uncertainty in the weather forecast, evacuate, get further inland. Most of the destruction is going to be right on the coast. And specifically on the right-hand side of the storm. The right front quadrant is the strongest part of the storm. So for example, Hurricane Katrina was moving north in the Gulf of Mexico, and when it hit the Gulf Coast, the right side, or the eastern portion of the storm, was the strongest. That's the side that hit Mississippi. The western side, the left front quadrant, hit New Orleans. So it could have been much worse for the citizens of New Orleans had that storm just wobbled a little bit further west. Volcanoes and earthquakes, again, I'll sort of I'm going to lump these together because they're both geologic forces that are very closely related. I do a lot of volcano expeditions around the world. And here's a map that shows earthquake activity around the world. And you can really clearly see the outline of these tectonic plate boundaries. Especially, of course, we've got the Pacific Ring of Fire, that gigantic Pacific plate that's bounded by so many other plates. And that's where we get a lot of the world's earthquakes, obviously. But it's also where we have most of the world's volcanoes in the Andes in Central America, through, of course, up in Alaska, down to Kamchatka and Japan, through to the South Pacific. So here's an example of a volcanic eruption that I was documenting in the Cape Verde Islands. This slow-moving lava flow was completely enveloping this town. The ground was shaking with volcanic tremors the entire time. And I was actually inside that building as the lava flow broke through that metal door. And less than a minute later, the entire wall collapsed. And we caught the whole thing on film. So when it comes to earthquakes and volcanoes, you're most likely to be affected by an earthquake unless you go actively seeking volcanoes, as I do. But you'll only have a few seconds to react. You may not even have time to run outdoors, and running during an earthquake as the ground is shaking can be quite dangerous. So your best bet is probably to just take cover under a doorway, under a sturdy desk if you can. If you're close to a door and you can dash out safely and get away from buildings, do that. But you are literally only going to have mere moments to react. You may not even understand that you're in an earthquake. You may think it's a truck driving past. It'll be over in 10 to 30 seconds. And if it goes longer than that, then it's likely a very big damaging earthquake. So one last thing I want to talk about is compound hazards. What happens if you have multiple disasters simultaneously? And I want to give you a very specific example of how bad things can get from a volcano expedition I did a couple of years ago. This is in Vanuatu, between Fiji and Australia. And we had a compound hazard here, this compound disaster, where we're on top of this active volcano where our base camp was. And then we had a big storm come in. So here's our base camp. You can see the glow of the lava. Below, it's about 400 meters to get down to where the lava is. And our mission was to rappel down to the bottom where the lake of lava is, where it's violently churning away. But our base camp got shredded by a storm that came in that was blowing around all of the toxic sulfur dioxide gas and all the volcanic gravel. And I've got a video clip here. Hopefully it'll play for us.
It's too dangerous. The visibility has gotten so poor that we'd be doing the descent virtually blind. Our visit to the crater will have to wait. Maybe next time.
Visibility has dropped down tremendously, which is never a good thing around here. And I'm starting to feel some drizzle coming in, which usually leads to torrential rains and storms.
You can hear the roar of the wind and the gravel being brought towards you. And then your tent just violently shakes. And it just keeps battering and battering and battering your tent until, you know, bit by bit there might be something that comes loose.
An unexpected storm has delayed our mission.
We need to seal that corner up too, or we'll lose that.
We've done everything we can to secure our tents. Now, we just need to hunker down and ride out this ferocious storm.
We were literally getting sandblasted by a fire hose of gravel and acidic rain. The acid rain there is so potent that it is like battery acid. So that's expedition life. But of course, the reality is we spend more time at home than we do while out on expedition. So disasters are more likely to strike when you're at home than you are when you're away. When you're out on expedition, you're planning for these things. We bring specialized safety equipment with us, right? But when you're at home, that's when we get the most complacent. And of course, there's that running joke where they say that most of accidents happen when you're at home, so I moved, right? But that is indeed true. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this over to my friend Jason, who's going to now basically take over and talk about disaster-proofing your life and your home.
George, some super cool stuff there, man. I'm going to have one question that I'm just going to jump in. You could think about it. when you're crawling into a volcano crater, what kind of underwear are you? Like, is SPF 1000 underwear? So first question.
Well, let me answer that in a somewhat serious fashion. We rappelled down on the ropes away from the lava. You can feel the heat on the back of your neck. But then when you walk up to the edge where the lava is, that's when I put on my protective clothing.
So no special underwear?
No asbestos underwear, no.
Disappointing. Disappointing. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and jump in here, indeed. And as George was pointing out here, listen, I have 100% fewer stories about boiling lava, unfortunately, but we're still talking about peril. And I'd like to ask you guys a question, which is, what is the greatest peril that you've ever been in? Obviously, Explorer Club members, so your answers are going to be way cooler than most people's. You know, things like climbing Everest or running ultra marathons through the Sahara. But it's one thing when we go on an adventure, when we go into the greater world on an expedition. You expect a level of hazard, right? Of danger. What happens when you come home, back to your family, your safe place, and peril comes calling? Those are storms we don't expect, and really the ones we least are ready for. So today I want to talk about preparing for the storms that knock on your doorsteps.
Just real quick, Jason, you have no slides visible, just as a heads up.
Sorry, nope, that's a problem. How about now?
Nope, just can see your camera. You're not sharing screen.
That's a problem. Let's try again here. There, I think this should work.
Disasters don't, yep, perfect.
There we go. So yeah, indeed, disasters don't happen on schedule, right? So what I want you guys to do is bring that expedition mindset back home. Who knew that this would be our situation today, right? We've got over 400,000 dead just in the USA alone. As George so rightly points out, that COVID-19 looms over everything. Those compound emergencies. In the middle of the pandemic, anything that goes wrong will be feel like it's piling on. I'm sort of calling them add-on disasters. Indeed, on the West Coast, during the last year, we saw scenes like these. The skies themselves were orange. The East Coast, the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season was the busiest storm season on record. We had 30 named storms. We did not see something like an Irene or Sandy here in the Northeast, thankfully. But guess what? This year could be the year or next year. So they will be coming. Bears in mind that home, your safe place, isn't necessarily so safe. So a rundown quickly of what I'm talking about, so the sort of home aspect is bringing that preparedness mindset home, but also you may have it. So many of you are explorers and adventurers, but I bet your greater circle may not, and you probably find that frustrating. So we'll talk a little bit about coaching friends and family to adopt that preparedness mindset. Then we'll get really practical. I want to get into 4 very concrete things you can start today. I promise there'll be no diagrams of 1950s style bunkers, okay? Just the really important stuff. Kind of like George hit the top points. Number 4 out of that will be something dear to my heart. I will say, George, your basement gave me deep equipment envy, but indeed, necessary gear and supplies to have at home. The great news is a lot of the stuff you bring on expedition is obviously easy to repurpose at home, right? Or it's an excuse to buy new stuff if you're like me. Real quickly, I have been a travel, culture, adventure journalist for over 25 years. That's put me all over the world doing really cool stuff with really interesting people. Through those situations, situational awareness has been really important. I've done those things that are probably old hat to so many of you, traipsing around the Amazon. I reported on indigenous people and the incursions in the rainforest by ranchers and loggers. Indeed, I have my favela stories. I spent some time with the most famous rap crew in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, where they took me on a tour of the favela. They included the place where they dropped the murdered people onto a top of a mountainside. And you know that because the buzzards would be out. Good times there. I've actually been thrown off a horse on 4 continents, twice in South America. In Mongolia, I spent a week horsebacking with nomads and was basically thrown off within the first 15 seconds, to the great delight of about a dozen nomads who were watching me, who thought that was absolutely hysterical. Perhaps I should sort of rethink how well of what kind of writer I am. Just give that one up. When it comes to expeditions, my first real brush with the Explorers Club was a couple years ago when I got to join along as a journalist with the Hong Kong chapter during the Roy Chapman's Andrews Centennial Expedition, looking for dinosaur bones. Super duper cool in the Gobi. About my 4th night there, to jump on a little bit of George's experiences, we had one of these. During that, one of the members was stung by a scorpion, and another member who you probably know pretty well, Bob Atwater, actually got a humdinger of a concussion. They both had to be evacuated in the middle of the night to the nearest infirmary in the Gobi, which is not the best place to end up. We woke up in the morning and the roads we'd been driving were just dunes. So yeah, so I've seen some peril along my way. But every time I'd come back home to New York City, there were things like the blackout of 2003, 9/11, big hurricanes like Sandy or Irene. And finally, I was like, Jason, you're out in the field and you come home and these things happen that stop the city in its tracks. How do you get ahead of that? And so what I did is I approached it like a journalist. I couldn't find any good repository of advice other than sort of really apocalyptic things, right? Really fringy things. So I approached it as, how, as a coastal dweller or an urbanite or suburbanite, do you do these things? I started a company called Preparation Concierge, which was just a repository for that information. That was recently absorbed into another company called Black Umbrella, who's been around for 10 years, and they do sort of high-touch concierge services for people who want to get prepared. So bringing that all back around, I want to talk about my own greatest peril. And it did not happen out in the field, but it happened at my apartment in Chelsea, New York on a Monday night, beautiful August, sort of hot, humid night. And I woke up, was with my former wife, and we woke up to a bedroom roiling with smoke and heat. A fire had broken out 2 floors directly below us. The woman who lived in that unit was already dead. So we grabbed our cat, put it in a smelly gym bag, and went out the fire escape. No problem, right? Well, we got one flight down, and FDNY were already on the scene, and they were on the fire escape. And they said, "There's fire right below you." So they ushered us into a neighbor's apartment. Incidentally, the neighbor who was directly underneath or just directly above the fire. So not a great place to be. And so we found ourselves in the kitchen with a woman in a wheelchair who was a little older and her husband, and a bunch of firefighters who were in the full regalia. They had their face masks and oxygen. And there was a moment when I thought, wow, here we are in our bedclothes, our cat, and this is ridiculous. It just felt silly. And then the kitchen got darker. It's like the lights had gone out, but they hadn't. We were breathing this terrible, acrid smoke. And the firefighters were starting to panic. One was yelling into his mic, "We're trapped, we're trapped." I'd always thought like, the movie Backdraft, that you throw your mate over your shoulder and you leap through the flames and, you jump through a window. What I realized at that moment was, no, in fact, you just crouch into a ball and suffocate to death. Not so great. So finally, a firefighter grabbed my wife's hand and led us down a black hall into the interior landing where the staircase was, which was on fire. And I'll never forget my eyelashes starting to burn. And I thought, this is not how I expected it. I'm going to die with my wife and our cat in our Chelsea apartment. The firefighter went across the way, broke down a neighbor's door, and led us to the back side of the building where there was, lo and behold, another fire escape. We got out. That top window you see there is the apartment that we were trapped in. The woman in the wheelchair later did expire, very unfortunately. So Lessons I took out of that was storms don't come when you expect them. And even worse, I found out later that we could have reached that back fire escape from the roof. I'd never been on the roof, said no trespassing, mind you, but not that I follow that many rules anyhow. I just never expected to need a third egress point from my house. You know, we had the fire escape, we had the stairs. What more could you need? So despite all those years of traveling, I thought I was totally mentally prepared, right? Turns out that when I got back home, I wasn't. I don't think it'll surprise a lot of you that the enemy of this mindset is the normalcy bias. You know, that belief that it isn't going to happen to you, right? The weather changes all the time. The pandemic couldn't happen here. Yeah, right. So we will pivot now to 4 very concrete steps how you can get started tonight, right? So first thing you need, and I think it's really important, is this. Okay, no, obviously not. I promised you no diagrams of 1950s style bunkers, but I do love this. They got the Geiger counter, emergency oxygen. They're quite well dressed for an emergency. The plumbing looks awfully scant. I do dig the periscope. I would want one of those, I think. I don't know what's happening in the atmosphere up there, but it does not look great. Look, practicality is your friend. You absolutely do not need bunker. You know, we're all busy, right? A lot of you are working from home, homeschooling. I've got an 8-year-old, we're homeschooling. That's great fun. These Zoom conference calls, you wouldn't want to miss them, right? So we're busy. So you need to make it practical. So I want to break it down into, again, these 4 basic steps. The first is, look, what is most likely to assail you at home? If you live on the West Coast in a forest that's awful dry, I split my time between New York City, and we also have a house in the country in the Poconos, which is sort of an escape place as well. Look, storms and losing electricity are things I worry about. Zombie hordes, you need to get yourself a machete, get off this call. Neither George nor I can probably help you. The pandemic, I don't claim to be an expert at all, but we've got to think the longer it goes on, the more stress it places on systems. You know, shipping, your food suppliers, your public utilities, the people who take care of those public utilities. So be careful of that normalcy bias. You know, today you've got your Netflix and you've got, you know, a full freezer full of great stuff and fresh produce, but don't expect that that will necessarily be the case tomorrow, because we just don't know. And to that, the pandemic has done us a real disservice. I think a lot of people now think, oh, this is how a disaster goes down, right? Cool, I got it. I'm rocking the hell out of this pandemic. But in fact, that's not the way most disasters go down. And it brings me to sort of my greatest fear as sort of at home, which is, you know, now that you're on your Zoom call and all is going so well, you know what would be really inconvenient? Yeah, losing juice, right? You wouldn't be on this call right now. Shame for you. Listen, we are so dependent on electricity for everything. And if you rely on public utilities, you are vulnerable. Think about all those things that we lose without juice. I mean, obviously light and heat, air conditioning, may lose your water, right? Especially if you're in a big city. Refrigeration, those communications, that cell phone that we're so over-reliant on, gas, financial transactions. So think about this when you were thinking about it. Imagine not just a day or even a week, but a month without electricity. What would your life look like? How do you get sort of prepared for that? Moving on to step 2, and this will resonate with so many of you, and that is a strength in a like-minded team, right? Having that collective around you. That could be the people you live with and your neighbors, and they could also be your aged parents or aunt, uncles who live, you know, elsewhere in Illinois or whatever. So how do you get those people on board? Because we are a collective. So it brings us to what I call the talk. People get squirrely when you say, hey, I want to talk about bad things happening to us, right? You'll find that your mom is like, let's talk about, would you see that Netflix show? Or, you know, people don't want to talk about it. They get really nervous. So here's my advice. Couch it in terms of sort of love and caring, right? Hey, Mom, I need a favor. Can you indulge me and help me by taking away some of my worry about you guys? You're doing me a favor by allowing me to help plan for all of us. Avoid sort of haranguing or lecturing or getting into a power struggle with, say, your parents or, your siblings. Sound familiar? Maybe. You got the buy-in. Fine, we'll talk about it if we have to. So as soon as you get that buy-in, you need to basically segue into some actual plans right away. To be discussed. Communications go down. You, in a smaller geographical area, you may not have communications in that area, but you may be able to get out. So what I suggest is appointing a single contact outside of your general area that will then take roll call. Something bad happens, everybody can text that person. That person then can take that roll call and also sort of say, hey, here's who's missing, here's who needs help. You don't want everybody calling each other as something bad happens outside your door. Agree on basic levels of equipment and food. We all have that crazy Uncle Larry who lives, I don't know, Idaho or Wyoming, that doesn't have a Gmail account and hates talking on the phone. Something bad happens where you're at or where he's at, and he's got 2 months of food, then you can feel pretty confident that Uncle Larry is going to be okay for a while, right? So who's got what is a nice thing. Lastly, discuss shelter in place versus evacuation. I think often we think, we've got to get out of the house. But chances are to be more like the pandemic, the safest place for you is not on the road. Home may not be perfect, but it's where you got all your stuff and most of the people around you. So, if you can shelter in place, that might be what you need to do. That being said, somebody in charge says, get out of the house, get out of the house. To that, if there's a wildfire coming or potentially coming, you might leave your garage door open, keep the car parked faced outward, already have the stuff in your car. I'm always amazed at these people the fire's right here. What should we put in the car? Get ahead of it, right? Just get ahead of those things. Bring me to step 3, which is the actual plan. The last thing you want to do is be calling your mate or your kids as, the aliens attack, right? That's not what you need to do. When something happens, everybody should know the plan and be able to act on it as soon as possible. So, hey, who will pick up the kids if the kids are in school? The pet. How do you handle your pets? If you do have children, like I said, I've got an 8-year-old. For the last couple of years, he's known both of our phone numbers, our addresses, some basic information. Think about evacuation routes and also what kinds of transportation. New York City is an island. It's hard to get off of, right? If you live in LA, what happens if the 405 goes down because of an earthquake? What are alternate ways to get around? You might think about bikes, that kind of thing. Certainly electric bikes could be a good way to get out of town if need be. What happens if one of you are traveling? If you are on expedition and something happens back home and you lose contact, it's great to know where your family probably is. In our case, again, our evacuation plan is if we have to get out of New York City, PA here in the Poconos, we've got running water, we have a fireplace, we've got food laid away. So if I'm far away in Burma or Bhutan or someplace and something happens, I have a pretty good feeling that I know how my family will get here by foot if necessary. It's only 100 miles away, and that they'll be okay. Evacuation, practice it. Hey, if the gophers know well enough, right? Again, bringing me back to the thing that's most likely to happen to most of us is a house fire or an apartment fire. Evacuate, practice those routes. If I'd known about that fire escape, I'd have one less tale to tell. Nitty gritty here, ABC locations. House fire, something like that. Where in the neighborhood is everybody going to meet for that quick roll call? You may evacuate from different places in the house, different routes. You want to know where everybody is. So it could be a neighbor's house, a playground nearby. Something that is regionally local. You can walk to maybe in 10 or 15 minutes. If something gas leak in the neighborhood or there's a local wildfire, where are you guys going to meet? In our case, after the house fire, the apartment fire, we had friends in the Upper West Side. We went to their house. Our clothes were terrible smelling. We stunk up their house. They let us in. And the third is, again, if something's happening on the coast, you live on the coast, you need to be inland. Where are you going to go? Often I say 100-mile range is a good idea. COVID, to those compound emergencies, COVID affects things. If you might have gone to a relative's house who's older or fragile and you can't go there now, you need to figure out where else you're going to go. Have those discussions sooner rather than later. So, number 4, gear, at least last gear. So check out these people. Don't be these people. Okay, you don't want to be like these people. You don't need every piece of gear in the world. I'm going to bring the slide back. Practicality is your best friend. Look, if it's overwhelming, if you think you need everything, you just won't ever start at all. So don't make it daunting. George spoke to this very eloquently. Listen, know how to use your gear. If it's still wrapped in plastic, if you don't know if it takes AA's or 9-volt, if you need to read instructions when the lights go out, you might as well not have it. Go bags. Everybody loves talking about go bags. They're the sexy part of disaster world, I guess. I don't think they are the cornerstone of a plan. I do think having your house prepared is more important. That being said, you should absolutely have a go bag for everyone in the family, including kids, something in your car and something at work. They don't have to be super complicated necessarily, right? As George said, cash and small bills, big one. Medical kit, absolutely. Weather radio, a change of clothes. And when, we got snow here in the Northeast today. Be sure you go through those bags occasionally and figure out what needs to be switched out. Which brings me to socks. One great thing to go in your go bag is dry socks. So many of us have been on expeditions and would have, given our best friend for a dry pair of socks. So to that home, the things that I think are most important are water storage, food, and electrical and lighting needs. Water, we're too used to it. We turn the tap and it comes. We know it comes. So I think we sometimes forget that water is a necessity that isn't always available, right? Especially in a disaster. So you have to get ahead of that. And that's one of those things you have to get ahead of today. In New York City, I have these things on the far left called water bricks. They're 3.3 gallons each, and you can stack them up in a closet. I've got 10 of them that fit underneath my queen size bed. Don't influence my, my clothes or my size of my storage at all. It means I've got 33 gallons just at a get-go. Genius. At the Poconos house here, I got a garage. I've got a couple of these 55-gallon drums full of potable water. And third is these, camp-style filtration. That's a Life Strong. I know George showed one of his in his kit too. I travel with them. They go with me in my backpack no matter where I go. Listen, if I've got one, it means I've got water I can drink pretty much no matter what. So water, don't forget about it. Food, again, you're doing the pandemic, you probably pretty much got this, but have some really non-perishables on hand. Peanut butter, that big old bucket of oatmeal, that one lasts 10 years. I guarantee two things at the end of that month of eating that thing. You'd be sick of oats. You would be fed and you'd be real regular, right? So lastly, energy and lighting. I am particularly bullish these days on solar. Listen, solar lanterns are a great thing to have if you have access to some sunlight most days. In the middle of the night, you'd have light no matter what, and then you put it out to refill each day. That's great. The other thing is generators are great, but half the time they don't work. They're noisy, they cause fumes, they run out of fuel. Lithium ion batteries are getting better and better. A buddy of mine is just buying this Goal Zero system right here, where it's a lithium ion battery and they can daisy chain it to old school lead acid batteries. And you can have up to like 4 or 5 days of juice, up to 4 circuits, no fumes, and you can also hook it up to solar, obviously. So I'm down with that. I think that's a great option. So coming back full circle, now you've been overwhelmed by George and I of all of these tips. You can't remember any of them. I get it. What are you going to do today? First of all, don't put it off. Don't say, hey, okay, now it's time for gin and tonic, which I totally understand, but you might think about, again, thinking what the threats near you are. What are you most likely to be affected about? I love George's stories about volcanoes. I'm fascinated by them, but I don't think it's something I've got to worry about. Have that talk with people that are going to make them nervous. As soon as they say, fine, I'll deal with you, make those concrete plans with them. Those things about, how much food, where are you going to go, who's going to pick up the kids, blah, blah, blah. And lastly, use your gear, look at what you got, pull it out, figure it out, water, get that figured out, food, and lights. My last thought is, I think some people think this is fearful. I was joking that George and I are the fun disaster guys, but I do think that getting prepared is an act of reaching out and taking control. It's not something to be fearful about. And when you do, then you can't prepare for everything, but just having that basis, that foundation goes such a long, long way. So coming back to Sir George.
Oh, thanks so much, Jason. That is so true. You're talking about, not only just preparation, but in the scale of these disasters, of course, I know I certainly feel really small. And it's never a matter of trying to beat Mother Nature at her own game in terms of preparation. It's just about going with the flow and doing what you can, again, to mitigate and minimize those risks, right? Because if you have that mindset of man versus nature,
you've gone wrong, right?
You're going to lose every time.
Well, and you can't prepare for everything, right? I mean, to your point, you know where you're going, so you look at what's most likely to be problematic. But it's the same at home, right? I live in the woods in the Poconos. I don't expect wildfire being my primary issue, but it could be.
It certainly could be. Okay, so we got some questions coming in. This one specifically for you. How often do you empty? This is from Kevin, it's from Robin. How often do you change or refill those water bricks?
A really great question. As a matter of fact, been on my list. Last week, I poured out all the water bricks. And it was interesting. They've been there about 8 months. And you put in the drops, those drops you buy to try to stabilize the water. Actually, the water was good. I drank the water. It was fine. I tested it out. But really, every six months, arguably, it goes a year. It'll be fine. You might filter it one more time. My 55-gallon gallons out here, it's on my list to do. What I will say is kind of a rolling. You're not going to get it all done, right? So just put it on a rolling, like a rotation of to do these things. Put it on your to-do list. It's like your fire extinguishers. Take a look, see if those things are in green. Are they? You got them. Take a look. Today, but you can't do it all at once.
Yeah, it's like changing the batteries in your smoke detector. Right? Change your water on the same day or whatever. Figure out some schedule that works for you.
It's not sexy, but it's important.
Not sexy, but yeah, exactly. Greg Harris has a question here for me specifically. He's talking about the fire pit in Turkmenistan, where I did that big expedition where I descended down looking for extremophile bacteria. And he was wondering about governments and how the he wants to know my thoughts about how some overzealous governments basically trying to remove all danger. He visited that doorway to hell not too long ago, and they built a fence around it. And it really takes away from the experience of being there and sort of experiencing nature, because now you have this barrier. And I had the same experience because I did that expedition back in 2013, and I was back there again last year. So to answer your question, yeah, it sucked that they had a fence there. I really did not like that. I understand why they do it, and I'm partly responsible. I get it, because I helped to popularize that place by filming a big TV show there. And at the same time, of course, it became more popular with tourists, and now the government has to worry about people falling in. And yeah, it's a bit of a shame, but as much as I hate to say it, people make bad decisions. I'm not going to say people are dumb. There are some. But people do make bad decisions, especially if they're in an unfamiliar environment like that. So yeah, it does suck, but what can you do? More questions. One specifically for you, Jason. Although New York City, this is from Wendy. Although New York City got daily briefings from the governor after the shutdown back in March, what should have been done in like mid-February to better prepare each of us for the coming virus, in your opinion, of course? The first week of March, many people had no thermometers, masks, or any plan. So what could have emergency managers done better?
I mean, that's hard. And I don't claim to be, again, I'm not a scientist. I don't claim to be a pandemic expert at all. But we had masks. Look, we had N95 masks a long time ago because that was on my list of things too. And funnily enough, the N95 masks seemed like overkill to me at the time. I remember people asking me about them and thinking, long before the pandemic, and thinking, is this something I really need to stock? That funny thing is getting ahead of it. I think so often in all disasters, we know again, like the New Orleans is at great risk yet again for these big storms, right? And I think, governments don't like to get ahead of it because then they assume a liability, right? So I think when we had the news of the pandemic coming out of Wuhan, I remember saying in January, look, schools are going to close down and like it's going to hit us. There's no way it's not coming to New York City. And so sometimes I think you can't expect the governments to get ahead of it. You just have to use some common sense. I remember moms in our schools looking at me and saying, no, that can't be possible. And I said, listen, by March, schools will be out. And sure enough, unfortunately, that was correct. So a little common sense goes a long way, right?
Yeah, the one good thing to come out of the pandemic is that people now understand what happens during a pandemic and can prepare for it.
Unfortunately.
Sad,
right? Yeah, but
it's funny and ironic, but it is true. Tatiana's got a question. How did you guys get started in working in this field? I can't seem to figure out how to break into disaster work. And she says that she's been funneled into sitting at a desk by being a numbers person. She wants to get into doing more adventure. Let me just give my quick little blurb and then we can both take a stab at this. So what I did, I used to be an engineer and I used to build recording studios for a living, music recording studios and studios for film and television. And I would take my vacation time and I learned how to forecast the weather. And I went to go chase storms in Oklahoma and Texas for 2 weeks. And then the next year I did a little bit more and I saved up my overtime and I took a little bit more time off and it just kept snowballing until it got to the point where I had to quit my job and do this kind of stuff full time. It was a very slow process. It took years, but it's the kind of thing you can just chip away at.
It's a good one. You've got a rock star job, George. There's no question. I tell stories for a living and I'm jealous of your stories. So, you've got it pretty good, I have to say. In my case, I was always a journalist and I gravitated to the things that interest me. I still do. I've written about everything from, again, travel and adventure, racing cars. But personally, when I had a kid and lived in New York City, I looked around and thought how can't find the information I need as a New York City denizen to figure it out, right? So I used my journalistic skills to approach talking to people who did know things and then use just my communication skills to then do it. So I would say in that case, look for that need. You find emergency disaster people are so important, but I think they're sidelined, right? I think society doesn't know how important they are. So if you have an interest in it, it's only going to get more important with climate crisis. You are going to be a person in the future who matters. People will catch up to that eventually. I genuinely believe.
We have lots of questions streaming in. So I hope I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them.
And can pick us off at any point.
So Jenny wants to know, could you speak of tropical diseases? What kind of preparedness is needed for forest exploration? I don't know how much experience you have in jungles, but personally for me, malaria medications, if you're in a malaria prone zone. Here's the thing though, I really don't like taking them. They give me horrible nightmares. And I swear that I would rather deal with the malaria than deal with the trauma of these night terrors from taking the malaria meds. But having had dengue fever myself, let me tell you, it does suck. So mosquito mitigation is absolutely important. DEET is your friend in those instances. Like you said, taking care of your feet. Wet feet, no bueno. That kind of stuff. Leeches, I've been leeched, and yes, the salt trick, sprinkling salt on the leech will cause it to release. There's all kinds of little tricks like that. So there's a few pointers. You have any?
One of my big fears is and outside my door right here is ticks. It's so funny, but they're everywhere here, right? So I worry about electricity going down and ticks, including, I remember being in the Gobi Desert and you'd sit down and ticks would just swarm at you, So and the same stuff that works on mosquitoes, it's not actually DEET. There's another stuff, I can't think of what it is right now, but a promethium, something like that is fabulous, that I'm a big proponent of.
Here's a cool question from TC, specifically towards you, because it's about your son, and I don't have any kids, so I'm not going to answer this one. Jason, what do you pack for your son? Because if you have to evacuate or shelter in place, it gets boring, especially if the power is out. So what do you do if you have kids? Do you bring games? Do you have non-electrical activities set aside? I typically will bring a deck of cards on expeditions as well. So that really, but what about for kids?
Yeah, so Max, my son, has his own go bag that he carries, and we, sort of practice. I mean, it's a great thing about, like, you use the same gear that you use in your real life that you use for these, right? So, we go hiking. So he loves to hike. He's used to sort of being out in the woods, and we do multi-night hikes. And it's that same thing, reading, telling stories. We have an ongoing story that I tell, story time, right? Which is one of those things that doesn't weigh anything. You don't need it in your pack. Cards, I always think, are a great one. Your electricity goes out right now, and you've got 2 weeks of nothing to occupy your kids. You go back to board games, right? I mean, you're back to old school, 1930s. So I'm not afraid of kids being bored. I encourage kids to be bored because that's how it kicks in the imagination.
We got a question here specifically about winter weather and driving. So what if you get stuck in a snowstorm or run out of gas?
Canadian.
So, yeah, what's that?
Talk Canadian.
Canadian? Well, the number one thing that is probably the worst thing that you can do in that situation is get out of your car and start walking through the snow. Don't do that. Do not abandon your car. It is a nice shelter. It's easier to spot a car than it is to spot someone who's collapsed in a ditch somewhere. So if you do still have gas and you're stuck in the snow, especially on a remote road, crack your window open, run your car for a few minutes every hour just to get the heat going. You don't want to leave it on the entire time because you run the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning, and that will kill you dead pretty quick. Don't leave your car.
So my other gig is I write about cars for a living. So I'm actually a car expert. I will say two things. Tires. Tires are everything. The thing to not get stuck is good tires. So if you're all weather tires, you think they're going to solve all your problems, they probably aren't. And if you happen to have one of these performance cars, you may actually have performance tires that will be terrible in the snow. And the other thing is, do indeed we have in all our vehicles, we have a package of stuff in there that includes like a blanket. It does have extra socks, has the blinkers, those things. If you are buried in the snow, you need to be able to alert people where you are. So there's LED. Don't use those old school 1200 degree flares. They're dangerous. There's LED things that you can position around, so let people know where you're at.
Oh, but fire is so much fun. I love those road flares. Oh, geez, we've got a bunch of cool questions here. Here's one from Mark. What do you guys think about self-defense? Which is something we didn't really cover in this particular talk. I've been very fortunate that I've never had to lay hands on anyone during any of my expeditions. I don't know if you've ever had that situation.
I've been lucky, but I think part of that goes with, I lived in Brazil, I lived in Rio. I never went to the beach late at night because guess where you don't want to be late at night? Some of that's just using, the best self-defense is not putting yourself in a situation. That being said, you talked about crime, right? And sometimes no matter what you do, you could find yourself in a situation. Self-defense at home, I think, is a tricky one. I think that I actually recommend for like bear spray. Like it's illegal in New York City, but here in the Poconos, I'll tell you what, we have a big thing of spray here that if I need to do self-defense, it's better in many ways than, my ex-wife would not have to aim a shotgun or something. She could use a bear spray. It's non-lethal. I think there's other ways to think, but if you grew up with guns and you're comfortable with guns, then I think, that's a personal decision. I think you also have to know legally where you're at. And when you're on expedition, those are not necessarily things you can do anyway, right?
Right. Yeah. De-escalation goes a long way. It's so much better to not get into a fight in the first place. Of course, if someone comes at you, you do what you have to do to keep you and your loved ones safe. I've got a two-parter here, basically. Somebody was saying, oh, so maybe I'm not so crazy for having climbing ropes in my closet to hook up in case of having to rappel down 6 floors. This is from Jeannie. So it sounds like someone has already had these thoughts. And if you don't have a fire escape, but you've got a window and you have climbing gear, then why not sort of have it in a place, or at least understand and know where the best anchor points are. So if you have to do it in an emergency, you don't have to do it at the time, right?
Jeannie sounds like a badass.
Totally. Yeah, Jeannie, I want to meet you. You sound cool. But that sort of folds into this other question of the ladders, those types of ladders that you throw out of the window. How effective are they in New York City? Now, I've heard of this technology. It's basically kind of like a rolled up rope ladder, I think, that you just, like it's your own personal mini fire escape. Do you know anything about these?
I would say, most buildings, the newer buildings have, obviously sprinklers. We had an old building that caught on fire. The floors were sort of hollow. The flame went straight up, right, from where we were. Everybody else was told to stay in their apartments. They were firefighters in other apartments. They're like, the safest place for you right now is actually inside your apartment if you're not directly influenced by the flames. We were with the flames and smoke because we were underneath. I would tend to think doing something really dangerous to get out of something really dangerous is maybe not your best bet, unless, sounds like to me, pretending like you're Batman during a flame thing is maybe not your best move, unless there's no choice.
The reason why I'm laughing is because I own a grappling hook.
George,
Okay,
you're going to have a beer soon. I promise you.
Totally. So we got time for one more. This is from John, and this is directed towards you. Jason, living in a city, what's your thought process, or what would your thought process be in whether to evacuate during a no-notice disaster and potentially getting stuck in gridlock versus sheltering in place? Right? So if there was something that happened very suddenly, like 9/11, for example, or an earthquake, something with no notice, unlike a hurricane, because hurricane, you have a few days notice. What do you think?
It's a worry. I mean, that is a worry. And it is, what is the level of the threat, right? Like a 9/11, you're fine at home, right? There's no immediate threat. Something that is so devastating that you have to get out of the city, then I think that's something you have to consider, right? And knowing those evacuation routes, again, I now live up near the George Washington Bridge. It used to take me an hour to begin to get out of the city, downtown. I can be over the bridge now in 5 minutes by foot. That kind of makes me feel better, and maybe that's me being a worrywart, but there's something to be said for that. So knowing your routes, knowing how to get out of there, and again, having some kind of bag if you do need to evacuate. But normally, probably chances are, if you've got water, that's why having water in the city is an awful good thing, because it gives you some latitude that if you didn't have water in the city, then things would get desperate awfully quickly.
Awesome. I think we can squeeze like one or two more short ones.
Go for it, George.
See what we can do here. How much of your prep, this is from Tom, is for survive versus thrive? Do either of you plan for long-term no-tech situations?
How about you?
Yeah, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, for me, that comes in quite handy, because sometimes when I do these big volcano expeditions, I'm living in one of those tents on top of a volcano for 5 weeks at a time, right? And so that's a long time to be living in a tent. And we do crazy stuff, like things get weird. We have fun in these situations. I remember being choked in with bad weather for many, many days. And we built our own miniature golf course. We used a piece of bamboo and a butter knife to make a putter, and we used a line. We wrapped it in electrical tape to use as our ball, and we buried a water bottle in the volcanic ash to use as the cup, right? So yeah, we get creative with things like that. And as you mentioned, board games and card games. Card games are so easy, so portable. You just, it takes up no space in your luggage. And it's the little things that really make a big difference in that long haul. If you can laugh, then you're doing okay. Music helps too.
Your guitars. Hey, we're in a disaster. We're in this slow-moving disaster that, as you and I were talking about, right? This pandemic. And we know how important that your mental, just keeping your mental above, whether you were stuck in that tent or, you're able to have Zoom calls, there's still a low-level stress no matter what. So, that ability to keep your spirits up is really, really important.
All right, we're coming to a close here. If you still have questions, you can put them into the YouTube chat. And then Jason, if you and I, maybe if we have some time later, we could go in and try and answer some of them that way. That would be great. I want to thank everyone for coming out. We've got another really cool event coming up on Thursday at 6. And it's with George Kourounis. He is from the Southwest chapter of the Explorers Club, and he's giving this inaugural presentation about the International Year of Caves and Karst. And I'm a big fan of caving. I've spent a lot of time in caves all around the world, mapping them and discovering them, that kind of stuff. So I'm really fascinated by all of this whole series of presentations that we're going to have throughout the year, all on caves and karst. And we kick it off on Thursday. So if you're interested in caves, you know where to check it out. I'll be watching.
Me too. Hey, George, you're a rock star, man. I really appreciate your time as well. So I learned things from you today that I didn't know. So I didn't know fire traveled uphill. So.
Well, there you go. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Jason. Great to work with you. And everyone, stay safe.
And have a good time while doing it.
There you go. In that order.